Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining. Good afternoon, I should say, from New York, because there may be people joining us from different parts of the world. And I'm really delighted to welcome you. I'm Basilio Monteiro, Director of the International Institute for Communication, the main organizer of this event. And the Institute is residing in the Collins College of Professional Studies of St. John's University, and they're also partnering with the Tobin College's Center for Global Business Stewardship. And in fact, this idea was been brewing up in Professor Gevorkyan's head for some time, and saying how this could be done. This is okay. So this event is a scholarly civic involvement concerning the crisis in the Caucasus. This crisis in this area known as Artsakh and also known as Nagorno-Karabakh has been going on since 1921, when Stalin transformed into an autonomous province of the newly created Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan. It has endured Roman, Persian, Ottoman, Soviet regimes over the millennium. As scholarly civic activity, it is important to develop a discourse to engage and counter public misconceptions and ignorance that serve as a fodder for ethnic and national conflict, thereby opening the space for a better understanding of the issues and, more importantly, the people involved, and especially those who are bearing the brunt. So now I would like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Gevorkyan. He's the professor at Tobin College of Business.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Monteiro, and welcome everyone to this event. We are glad you were able to make it, but of course the reason for our gathering is, to put it mildly, tragic. It's the events that are ongoing for now almost a month, that we are all still in shock. A lot of us who are following the region are in shock. A lot of us who are working in the field of economic development or in simple sort of things following how societies develop and evolve remain in shock, because it seems to be that the war is still ongoing and there's no sight, there's an end, right? What we thought with this sort of gathering, and we're grateful to the two organizations that are helping us with today's meeting, the Institute for International Communication and the Center for Global Business Stewardship, is that we sort of motivate a conversation from drawing from three different perspectives. We have someone today, and I will allow our moderator in a moment who will introduce give proper introduction to the speakers, but just to give a quick overview, we have panelists coming from different perspectives: law, religion, philosophy, genocide studies, and also someone who can provide a political, historical context to the events. And before I pass it on to and introduce our moderator, who will be leading the discussion, some sort of housekeeping rules. Let's try to keep our microphones muted. Feel free to ask questions in the chat room. I will be monitoring that very actively. If there are any issues, please feel free to also type in. For the panelists, we're hoping for around 7 minutes, because we are trying to end within 1 hour. So 7 minutes for a presentation. Now, on to the main sort of program. I would like to pass on the microphone to our younger colleague, nevertheless, also the person who pretty much initiated, even though Dr. Monteiro mentioned it was brewing in my head, it was, but it takes someone to actually kind of spark the idea for things to start working, put in place. And so Isabel Arustamyan reached out with her sort of impressions and her rightful disappointment with the lack of the reflection and discussion about what's going on in Armenia right now in the global media. And we started the conversation, and this is how this panel came about. Isabel is a second-year law student at St. John's Law, and she has a personal story to tell as well. So I will pass it on to her. Isabel, please go ahead. I'm muting myself.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Gevorkyan. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This event was organized by the Institution of International Communication in response to the student group request to provide some discussion panel about the major war that spiraled in the Caucasus. Students like me today have to manage much more than just the stress of academic life in the middle of global pandemic, because my family has been affected by this conflict ever since it first broke out early in the 90s and continues to be affected by this today. My mom was born in Baku, Azerbaijan, and became a refugee when she was my age, during the time when the war first happened in the 90s. To avoid being killed for being Armenian, my mom left Baku after the Soviet Union's dissolution. She went on the last train, which was able to escape the violence. The next train got attacked while still in the territory of Azerbaijan. I was lucky to have never experienced the horrors of having to leave everything I worked for my entire life, including my home and my personal belongings. But my mom was not that lucky. And today I'm witnessing something similar happening to my close relatives, my dear aunts, my uncles, and my cousins. To understand why this is happening to our families, today we are lucky to have Dr. Artyom Tonoyan. Dr. Tonoyan is a research associate in the University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. We're also lucky to have Dr. Mark Movsesian, who is a Frederick A. Whitney Professor of Law and the Director of the Center of Law and Religion at St. John's University. Also, I would like to introduce Dr. Siobhan Nash-Marshall, Merity Clark of Christian Philosophy in Manhattanville College. And to start this discussion, I would like to first ask you, Dr. Tonoyan, can you please tell us about the background of the conflict, why it started, and when?
Sure. I would like to start by first thanking Aleksandr and Isabel and the co-panelists and Basilio for organizing the gravely important topic. As for why did it start and when did it start and the background, I'm a sociologist, social historian. I look at the la longue durée, as the French say, of the conflict usually, but I'll make it briefer. I mean, there are a couple of sort of points of origin for the conflict. The most closest to our timeline is the 1980s, 1988, to be more precise, January, February 1988. But of course, we can take it back even further to 1920s when, for some reason, we still don't know why, Stalin and his coterie of advisors decided that the idea of Nagorno-Karabakh being part of the newly established Soviet Armenia was a bad idea, despite the will of the people and the decision of deputies of the Soviet Revkom. They decided to transfer Nagorno-Karabakh from under the jurisdiction of Soviet Armenia to the jurisdiction of Azerbaijan. We still don't know why. The archival record is really confusing on this issue. We still don't have clear reasons for why the decision was taken, and one way or the other. But since the transfer was a fait accompli in 1921, there were always these simmering tensions between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. It was more or less managed. It was more or less controlled by the Soviet central authorities. And you have to realize in Soviet Union, national aspirations were really national aspersions. It was looked down upon, it was frowned upon because the Soviet Union was an internationalist project, brotherhood of the nations, so on and so forth. But these tensions continued. There were flashpoints in 1960s and in 1970s, but they were managed. And when we fast forward to 1980s, we see when Gorbachev came to power, he proclaimed two very important things, perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika meaning the restructurization of the Soviet economy, which was flagging, which was sagging, and was really being behind its Western counterparts. So the Soviet Union decided to change the economic dynamics of the country. The second was the glasnost, which was freedom of speech, which meant that previously taboo subjects having to do with a number of issues, religious, social, political, could be now openly discussed. Of course, within certain frames of reference and within certain parameters. And if you stepped outside of these bounds, the recriminations were swift and visible. But in 1980s, late 1980s, taking advantage of this new openness, Armenian intellectuals, Armenian nationalist intellectuals with roots in Nagorno-Karabakh, but not also, started organizing signature gathering campaigns and sending them to Moscow to address this historic injustice as they perceived it and seeking redress. And they had certain important points to make. The Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh were undergoing discrimination, cultural, social, and political. There was no contact between Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh institutionally with the Soviet Armenia. And then the third, probably most important thing was that there were tremendous demographic changes in Nagorno-Karabakh, where Armenian ethno-religious component of the Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous oblast was undergoing demographic change, not in favor of Armenia. At the beginning of the establishment of NKO, the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, the population of the region was 94% Armenian. In 1980s, the population of Armenians was 75%. So you had a net loss of about 20% demographically, which Armenians perceived as sort of a wild present in sort of the Armenian mind. So from there, the conflict would develop from the nationalist discourse into real fighting in 1988, when in response to Armenian mass demonstrations, peaceful mass demonstrations in Armenia, in Armenian cities and in Nagorno-Karabakh, some Azerbaijani youth in a town of Sumgait, not far from the capital of Baku, decided to take matters into their hands and teach the Armenians a lesson, ending up killing 32 people in a rather brutal fashion. And from there, it was basically downhill. The pogroms would be repeated 10 months later in Kirovabad, where 120 Armenians were also brutally killed. And then in 1990, when the apogee of the whole thing was the massacre and expulsion of the Armenians in Baku, again, around 150 Armenians would be killed, again in brutal fashion. And from there, the conflict started.
Thank you so much for this information, Dr. Tonoyan. The following question I would like to ask is to you, Dr. Movsesian. Can you please tell us whether religion plays a role in the event taking place now, and whether religion was ever a component of this conflict?
Okay, thank you, Isabel. And I'd like to join Artyom in saying thank you to you personally for doing all you did to put this together, and also to Alek, and also to Basilio, and to my fellow panelists. So when people look at this sort of conflict from the outside, there are two mistakes people make. Some people say this is all about religion. And I think that's a mistake. And then some people say this has nothing to do with religion. And I think that's also a mistake. I think religion is an important factor in what's happening here. And to explain that, you have to go back further than Dr. Tonoyan was going. You have to sort of go back to the great sweep of history in this region. So Nagorno-Karabakh, it's about the size of Delaware. It's a region now in Azerbaijan. Of course, even Armenia doesn't recognize it as independent just yet. But it is a region that has been Armenian and Armenian Christian really for thousands of years. This is where Saint Mesrop Mashtots, who created the Armenian alphabet, had the first Armenian school. That monastery where he created it, where he had the school, is still there in Amaras. There are many other Armenian monasteries throughout. I've been to one of them in Gansazar. So although Karabakh has been part of different empires over the centuries, its identity has always been predominantly Armenian. And because of those long Christian associations, going back 1700 years at least, Artsakh is a very important part of the Armenian Christian identity. So to understand the present conflict, I think you have to go back to the 1920s, the aftermath of the genocide. So for people who don't know, this all dates back to the end of World War I, to the breakup of the Ottoman and the Russian empires. Armenians lived on both sides of the border and found themselves in the crosshairs. And during World War I, fearful that Armenians would join Christian Russians and rise up against them, the Ottoman government decided to remove the Armenian threat by basically eliminating Armenians. Now, the threat from Armenians was greatly exaggerated. There were some Armenians who fought for the Russians, but there were also Armenians in the Ottoman army. But the Turks didn't see it that way. The Ottoman Turks didn't see it that way. And so they unleashed an ethnic cleansing campaign, which was the Armenian genocide. And it's important to note that although the genocide had lots of different factors, religion was an important one. And I want to refer the listeners to a really interesting book by two Israeli professors, Benny Morris and George Zavi, called The 30-Year Genocide, came out from Harvard University Press last year, which points out that this was a campaign against the Ottoman Empire's Christians in Anatolia. It wasn't just Armenians. Armenians suffered the worst, but it was also Greeks and Assyrians as well. So the genocide, which clearly had a religious motivation, eliminated the once sizable Armenian population on the Turkish side of the border. It probably would have eliminated the Armenian population on the other side of the border as well, except that Armenians hastily organized a force and at the Battle of Sardarabad were able to stop the Turkish advance. And as I've written recently, Sardarabad is basically unknown in the West. But this is a very important battle for Armenians. The idea of Armenian Christians defending themselves against a Turkish Muslim force that is bent on their annihilation is really a very important part of the history and self-image of Armenians. Now, at the time, the Azeris, who were on the other side of the border, saw the invading Ottoman army as liberators. In fact, this is when Azeri national identity really begins. Before this time, the ethnic population was not called Azeri. It was referred to as Tatars or Caucasian Tatars. And these were a Turkic people, but they were Shia Muslims, so they were sort of linguistically and culturally associated with Turkey, but religiously with Iran. There was then a brutal war between Armenians and Azeris that took place in the 1920s. There were massacres of Armenians at the time, including in Shushi, which some of the listeners may know. That's where the Armenian cathedral is that was just shelled recently. There were massacres there. I think it's important to see the Azeri-Armenian War as a side theater of the genocide. It wasn't the genocide, and our Armenians don't claim the Azeris were part of the genocide, but it was a side theater. And really the two elements came together in the Caucasus at that time, and Armenians remember this. When the war ended, and here Dr. Tonoyan has already said this, when the war ended, the Russians quickly settled things. They gave up some Armenian lands to Turkey around the city of Kars, and then they divided up the Caucasus among themselves. And as Dr. Tonoyan says, Stalin made the decision when he was Commissar of Nationalities to give Karabakh to the newly formed Azeri Soviet Socialist Republic. I guess it's not known by historians why, but as a non-expert, I can guess why. It was part of a divide and conquer strategy to make sure that no nationality could develop a kind of critical mass in the Caucasus. And Dr. Tonoyan has then given you the history from there. Now, if we just speed up to the present, the thing that really makes this, the thing that really emphasizes the religious component here is the fact that Turkey is now really pushing this war. And President Erdogan said over the summer that, it's time for Turkey to finish up the job, the mission of our ancestors, the mission of our grandparents in the Caucasus. Well, when Armenians hear that, they know what that is. And because Turkey has now introduced Syrian jihadis into the fight, the fact that Turkey talks about the remnants of the sword, the people who were left over from the last genocide, it's clear and given that the genocide had a clear religious component, it's clear that religious component continues today. Now, that being said, I just want to clear up a couple of things before I pass it on to my other panelists. I'm not saying that religion explains everything. It doesn't. In the West, people think, well, Armenians are Christians and the Russians are Christians, so the Russians will help them. And so far, Russia has been very passive in this. You might think that Iran would jump to help their co-religionists in Azerbaijan, but that hasn't happened. So it's a complicated thing. But I do think that religion is an important part of this conflict, and people in the West need to understand it as such. And with that, I guess, Isabel, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Movsesian, for this information. To transition into the next question, I would like to ask you, Dr. Nash-Marshall, do you think there is a connection between the Armenian genocide, the trauma of genocide, and the events that are happening now?
Well, yes, and thank you, Isabel, and like Mark, Professor Movsesian, and Professor Tonoyan, I'd like to thank you. And I think that this event is very important. And so I'll just jump in right away and piggyback off what Mark said and what Artyom said. There is a genocidal component, and it's extremely important. And where Professor Tonoyan went back to the 80s and Professor Movsesian went back to the 1920s, I'm going to jump back even farther. When today, Erdogan talks about the remnants of the sword, and we have to continue the project of our forefathers. I think that we have to understand, A, what that project is, and B, why it is genocidal. So I want to jump back into terms. I guess this is the philosophy part of me. I need to understand terms carefully. So a genocide, as we know, there is a genocide convention, and that gives us the definition of what a genocide is. And I think it's important from a scholarly point of view to stick to it. We also know that it was developed by Raphael Lemkin because he was contemplating the Armenian genocide. Now, I think there are two main components of just the crime of genocide. First of all, it's a crime. And I think it's important that everyone remember it's a crime. It's not an idea. It's not a philosophical idea. It's a crime. So it's a legal crime. And as a crime, it is a subset of the vaster definition of crimes against humanity. And what distinguishes it from crimes against humanity is its intention, right? And that intention is to eliminate a genos, which is the Greek word for a unit, a family unit, which Lemkin then says could be a religious, ethnic, political, or national minority. Why is this important? Genocide takes place, A, by killing this minority, or then they give several other actions, causing mental harm, and then there are two more. I don't want to get into the details. In the case of the Ottoman Turks versus the Armenians, there was a destruction policy, but with it, that destruction policy is part of a bigger ideological plan. And what was that plan? Well, if you look through the Halibut tapes, or if you look through the various ideologues who formulated this Ziya Gökalp, and one of them, by the way, was a Tatar, one of the important ones. Their idea is that they need to form a new Vatan, the Turks do, on a piece of land because the dismembering of the Ottoman Empire left them with no lands that they could claim to own on the basis of descendants. This is extraordinarily clear in the case of Gevorkyan makes this, all of the ideologues do. Now, why is this important? Armenians actually can claim proprietorship of the land on the basis of descendants. This is the case in what was called Armenia, which are the Armenian highlands in Western Armenia, now called Eastern Anatolia. This is the case for Yerevan. This is the case for Artsakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh as it's known. Turkey had and had a very deliberate two-pronged approach to this. To invent a history that would eradicate their presence in those lands in history in one way, shape, or form. Another, it's to eliminate the natives, the locals, and whatnot. As Professor Movsesian mentioned, this does not only include the Armenians. They did the same with the Chaldeans. They did the same with the Greeks, the Pontic Greeks they kicked, the Aegean Greeks they transferred to Greece. And if you look at the numbers, the policy is extremely clear. I know Armenians like to look at the genocide from the point of view of 1.5 million. I prefer to look at it in terms of percentages. So in 1914, if you look at all the numbers, roughly 25% of what is modern day Turkey today was Christian. And they are the ancient peoples of, right, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Armenians, the Greeks. In the 1927 census, it was down to, let me look, 2.7%. So we went from 25% to 2.7%. Obviously, what this means is a lot of people vanished. Why is this important to remember when it comes to Artsakh? Sardarabad was mentioned, and it is an important piece of the puzzle. But another important piece of the puzzle is Pan-Turkism, which is precisely grounded in the ideology I was mentioning, the ideology that you can find, again, in people like Gevorkyan. What that ideology basically claims is that the Turks have to form an empire that stretches from Constantinople, so modern-day Istanbul, all the way to the east. Armenia is in the way. The first attempt in 1918, and this is why Sardarabad was fought, the Turks actually, they knew they were losing the war. Nevertheless, they thought they would make one last-ditch attempt to link themselves to the Turkic peoples in Azerbaijan, which did not exist at that point. Let's remember it's a modern country. And they sent two armies, one going up through modern-day Iran, and then the other through what was then called Western Armenia, the Armenian highlands. One army was blocked, the other was not. They eventually met in Baku, and then that was when the September massacres took place. Now, when Erdogan sits back and he says, we have to finish the job, it's not killing all the Armenians, which is definitely part of his job, or what he considers to be his job. It's also to connect Turkey and Azerbaijan with that corridor that they wanted to form in 1918. So is this war now connected? Oh, absolutely. Erdogan has said as much. And let's also not forget that that this outbreak that began about 3.5 weeks ago, September 27th, actually was preceded by maneuvers in Nash-Marshall in August, and in July, an attack on Armenia by Azerbaijan. This has been planned for a long time. So I think I answered your question, Isabel, did I?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Now to connect the pieces, Dr. Tonoyan, I would like to go back to you. Could you please explain why this is happening now? What's so special about this time, and why the conflict spiraled again?
Well, there's a number of reasons. Political, military, economic, you name it. There's a lot of underlying and problems and reasons. But why now? I think one of the biggest reasons is that Azerbaijan, rightly or wrongly, that they could take on this war with this scale and ferocity and create facts on the ground. Why did they come to believe this? Well, Azerbaijan, as all of you know, is a wealthy oil country. The first war in 1994, Azerbaijan has undergone a tremendous economic changes. They signed in 1994 the deal of the century that connects Baku with the Mediterranean, where they could siphon off the oil and sell it to the Western markets for the duration of the Soviet Union. So they had a windfall from oil revenue for well over 2 decades. And this oil revenue necessarily translated into arms purchases and training and diplomatic offensive against the Armenians and Armenian interests throughout the Western, not only, also in Russia and so on and so forth. So they had they thought they had military advantage, and in some fashion they do. They have better armaments than Armenia does. They have bought a ton of sophisticated weaponry from Israel, matched only with a ton of sophisticated weaponry from Turkey, and also, of course, from Russia, who supplies both Armenia and Azerbaijan with weapons. The second reason, probably the biggest reason, is the Turkish factor. The Turkish factor had all but diminished in the conflict because of the fact that Russia considers the Caucasus its traditional backyard. It's near a road, and it has not really allowed foreign interference historically. We see things changed in Georgia, where there is now an American base. So Russia is very neuralgic about having another conflict in its soft underbelly or close to it. And so Turkey, however, begs to differ. As our co-panelists have noted, Turkey wanted to make new inroads into a territory that it considers sort of sacred for historic reasons, for political reasons, and for and religious reasons, because of its ethnic and religious ties to Azerbaijan. And Armenia has been sort of, since its independence, a sore sort of a nuisance for Turkish foreign policy projection over the region. For one, there has been always this Armenian drive to have the recognition, to have the genocide recognized, which has been a perennial nuisance in Turkish politics since the time of the genocide. And the Turks, or the Turkish leadership rather, political, military, felt that it is time to teach the Armenians a lesson. And this lesson could be taught vicariously or through proxy through Azerbaijan, who was best sort of positioned to inflict harm on Armenia with the help of Turkish military and economic and diplomatic mechanisms. And so I think those are the two main reasons. Azerbaijan feeling confident that they can solve the problem through military means rather than diplomatic means. diplomacy has done nothing to redress their grievance. And the second factor, probably the most important factor, really, is the Turkish putting its finger on the scales and helping Azerbaijan to achieve military dominance over Armenia and to solve its problem, long, lingering, festering wound with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Very quickly? I wanted to, this is interesting. Thank you very much for your perspectives. I wanted to connect back to just Dr. Tonoyan mentioned with the remarks by Dr. Movsesian. And specifically, it appears to be sort of kind of, to put it in simple words, some type of a grand project that we're living through. And sort of those Armenians and those who relate to this sort of humanitarian cause much more closely, non-Armenians, right, across the world, are all in distraught. But Dr. Movsesian, so connecting with your discussion viewpoints on the religious component of this, do you think there may be some role for kind of diplomatic solution at that level, maybe with the participation of the Vatican and so on? Sort of what is their stand on this?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. I don't know. You know, there's a joke, at least in the United States, it's a sad joke, it's not a happy joke, but about Mideast Christians. You know, Mideast Christians in the United States, they're too Mideast for the right, and they're too Christian for the left. And so no one really takes up their cause with any degree of enthusiasm, because no one really relates to them, right? Because of the essential foreignness, and also, well, I said, too Christian for the left, too Mideast for the right. So I don't know that there's going to be a groundswell of sort of Christian solidarity here. I mean, I wish that were wrong. I don't know. And in Europe too, I think there's some sympathy for Armenians, but whether that sympathy will extend to actually a humanitarian campaign, I don't know. And Alec, can I just broaden this? Because I mean, look, I run the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's. I co-direct it, and so I think about these things. But it's not only religious. I mean, you might look. Armenia is a democracy. Armenia is a real democracy. You know, they had the election in 2018 in which an unpopular government fell and a more pro-Western government came in. Azerbaijan is not a democracy, and Turkey is not a democracy. So even if you put aside the religious solidarity you might hope for among Western Christians and Mideast Christians, for people who care about democracy, for people who care about human rights and popular representation, you would think they would be sympathetic. But unfortunately, the sympathy seems to be limited. I don't see. I mean, there are nice statements, but I don't see. I don't see that kind of either on the basis of co-religion or on the basis of common human rights commitments. At the moment, I'm not seeing any groundswell from the West at all. And
we don't have an explanation for that. But Dr. Nash-Marshall.
I can. Yeah. I mean, anybody can. Dr. Siobhan, if you want to go ahead, you can.
Oh, please, Mark. I think we're on the same page here. And I think part of the issue here is something that no one really wants to talk about. And I would like to pick both your ear, Mark, and your ear, Artyom. I really think that if you look at the issue from the point of view of pan-Turanism, if you look at the issue from the point of view of the nationalism and the Azeris, I think you will find a cause that most people are not seeing, and that links to the democracy side and that links to everything else. Ever since the beginning of the 19th century, so I'm going to go even farther back for a moment and say, what was the big problem for the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century after they began to suffer loss after loss after loss? The problem was that they had no unifying identity. And this is something that all of the thinkers in the second half of the 19th century pointed out. I'm thinking of people like Yusuf Akçura, who, by the way, is a Tatar. He's not a Turk. But nevertheless, he laid out the problem for the Turks, and he identified with them. Ziya Gökalp, and what is their point? Look, we're actually an empire over this land where all these different peoples live who aren't Turkish, And they're going to break off from us. The Christians are going to do the starting. So what we have to do is impose a new identity on them, and we will vent that. We'll call that Turkishness. Now, here's the part that's interesting. Turkey now, from that point of view, is not on solid grounds. The Kurds are not Turks, and they don't want to be. That's millions of people. You have the Circassians, you have the Laz, you have the minorities who are obviously being repressed. And here is where I'm going into Mark's point. Turkey is not a democracy. And they're being forced, homogenized into this identity. If I'm not mistaken, Azerbaijan has 11 major minorities. And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, they include the Talish, they include the Lezgins, and one of the reasons, I think, one of the questions we should all ask ourselves is, why is Azerbaijan resorting to using mercenaries, which they do, if they are so gung-ho about this? And I think you'll see that Azerbaijan is also in a very weak moment from the point of view of national coherence, their cohesion. They are not strong from that point of view. And Turkey has always used belligerence to create internal cohesion. This is one of the things. So I think one of the reasons they're attacking Armenia and Armenians is to give the various minorities a common enemy. That's a very old tactic. And why do the Christians not stand with the Christians? This is a blight on us all. And so I hope and I pray as a Catholic that it not just the leaders of the church, but the people themselves can come together and pray. I mean, literally sit down and pray together, because that's what we need to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Isabel, may I jump in again? I don't know if Artyom, you want to add anything to this? We do have a question already in the audience. So.
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Basilio, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I would like to bring up here the subject of gas pipeline, and which is the oil pipeline, which is almost like, I'm looking at the map here, from Azerbaijan moving all the way to Greece. 97% of it is completed by now, and then afterwards the other pipeline is already completed from Azerbaijan to Ceyhan in the Turkey. So the gas oil pipeline has kind of changed their allegiances. Those who kind of has gone beyond Catholic countries or Christian groups supporting, because these are now economic issues and heavy investments, and kind of you can see Italy is moving all the way to Italy, the pipeline, which is, that part is not constructed as yet. But since the other pipeline is 97% completed, what factor does it play in how the alliances are being built right now?
Well, obviously, when you have it is playing an important role, and probably in some ways it is also playing an overwhelmingly important role, because the investment in the oil sector in Azerbaijan, which, by the way, is their number one export, other than agricultural foodstuff to Russia and Ukraine and in the former Soviet territories. That is Azerbaijan's number one sort of export. And because it is right now, energy is the dominant factor in politics. It has been since the discovery of oil as a source of energy, right?
Yeah.
But it has become even more so in today's world. But something needs to be mentioned that is sort of a corollary to this oil pipeline diplomacy, if you will, in that the money that Azerbaijan has gained from this, it hasn't it has not only gone to sort of bettering its economy, which, by the way, is not that different, despite the oil revenue, from the economies of Armenia and neighboring Georgia on average. Sure, the GDP is higher. There are fancier cars in downtown Baku, higher buildings in downtown Baku, more billionaires in Azerbaijan. But having said that, what the money has done also is it has allowed to literally buy off European diplomats and buy off European politicians, which is very, very important and needs to be mentioned. There was a recent investigation by OCCRP, which is one of the best investigative journalistic outlets that does investigations on government corruption in various countries, and they have now taken a deep interest in what Azerbaijan has been doing, is that they set up slush funds to the tune of close to $3 billion and use this cash to court Western politicians, people in various places of influence, and drive policy decisions, not necessarily in the best interests of their countries, of Azerbaijan's foreign policy objectives. There are a number of Italian politicians implicated in this. There are a number of British politicians implicated in this, number of German politicians, Belgian politicians, the list goes on. And in the United States, it's a lobbying arm, which is far than anyone could have imagined even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So the oil pipeline has contributed to the conflict in a sense that it has contributed to the conflict epiphenomenally, if you will. It is not directly influencing the conflict, but because there are these economic interests involved, and because there is this wealth and this amount of money involved, it has absolutely sort of changed the dynamic of the Western perceptions of the conflict and Western perceptions of who the aggressor is and who the victim is. And so you have a lot of politicians who know better, equivocating on who started the war, why it started, and so on and so forth, creating confusion through editorializing, through appearances in newspapers, TV channels, and news agencies, and so on and so forth. And I'm not even talking about the bought and sold academics, really, that are essentially writing books on demand, pushing the Azerbaijani state propaganda in a much more polished and palatable for Westerners way. So yes, in that sense, it is absolutely redefining the political alliances because money talks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yep.
It's a sad reality. Go ahead, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tonoyan. Thank you. As our time comes to an end shortly, there are some questions in the audience, and if you don't mind, I would like to ask them. Kachatur recently asked whether Armenia should pursue this matter in the international courts. I believe this would be a good question for you, Dr. Movsesian. Could you please reflect on that?
Well, a little. So I have to say I'm not an expert in international law in this respect, but so in international law, let me answer it like this. So in international law, we have two competing principles. One is pushed by Azerbaijan all the time, and that is territorial integrity. That the international law recognizes the principle of territorial integrity, and their position is Karabakh is part of our territory. Now Armenians have arguments about that. It was given by Stalin. If you look at exactly when Azerbaijan became independent, Karabakh was already saying it didn't want to be part of Azerbaijan. So whether it is effectively, in a legal sense, part of Azerbaijan would be debatable. The other principle is that of remedial secession, which holds that when a population is in danger of persecution and repression and genocide, there is a right to secede because that's the principle of self-determination. So you have these two principles warring. There are some very good articles on the internet right now about why Armenia's position as a legal matter is quite strong, and I believe that. Having said that, international law is really a matter of enforceability. And at the moment, I'm not seeing a lot of international will to enforce any legal judgment in favor of Armenia. In fact, quite the opposite. Now, people talk about Kosovo. You know, Kosovo is a kind of a similar situation, arguably. And the West backed an independent Kosovo and took Kosovo away, and there's now an independent Republic of Kosovo. But that, I think a realist would look at that and say, that is because of other concerns, not legal concerns. There were realist reasons why the West wanted to break up Yugoslavia. So, and that's not to denigrate the suffering of Kosovars. I'm not trying to do. I'm just saying that if you look at things, the legal perspective, I think actually Armenia has a pretty strong argument. But then I ask myself, well, would the international community enforce such a thing? And you know, at the moment, as I say, it doesn't look like there's a lot on the table. But that's just my view. I mean, I'm not an expert in these questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Movsesian. Before I go to the last question that was asked, I would like to go back to you, Dr. Nash-Marshall. If I may ask a bit of a personal question, I believe you are personally familiar with the region of Nagorno-Karabakh. Can you please share more about that and your impressions as well?
I am personally involved very much, and I have worked with the Artsakh for years. I first went there in 2015, and then I set up a school there, and then an internship program, a whole series of things. I work very closely with the government, and I think you said the land is beautiful, the land is gorgeous. And one of the things I think everyone should see is Dadivank. Dadivank is probably one of the most extraordinary places in the world. Amaras is gorgeous, it was mentioned before. But Dadi is, of course, the disciple of Saint Thaddeus, and he is an apostle. So it's very, very old. I can give you firsthand this about the Artsakh. I would say that the Turks have decided to choose to fight the wrong Armenians. Because if there is any group of people, as they say of themselves, Dukhofenk, they have internal battle. This war has never ended, and this is, again, one of the things that people don't want. It's not as though the ceasefire in 1994 actually was really respected. I mean, snipers were constantly taking out 1 or 2 a week on the borders, also in Armenia. So it was never something that Turkey and Azerbaijan ever meant to let go. The other thing is, being an oblast, and I don't know exactly, but Georgia had 2, right? Ossetia and Abkhazia. And I think that Nakhichevan was an oblast too. And I don't know if being an oblast actually constitutes you being part of a territory. I don't know. I wish the legal people would talk about this. Is that a good enough answer for you, Isabel? I just say everyone go to see our talk.
That's the perfect answers. Thank you so much. The next question is from the audience, and Nicholas wants to know, since Georgia was mentioned, and he's asking, what is the relationships between Armenia and Georgia, and why isn't there more solidarity between the two? Dr. Tonoyan, would you please answer that question?
Sure. The relationship with Georgia is amicable and friendly between Armenia and Georgia. Azerbaijan has a different sort of relationship with Georgia. Georgia has both Armenian and Azeri communities. Both of them are quite sizable and probably equal in numbers. Armenians mostly live in Tbilisi, the capital, and in a region called Javakh or Javakhet in Georgian. But Georgia also is a conduit of very oil and gas pipelines. So it brings to the tune of $400 million, 300 plus, close to $400 million of transit fee that Georgia extracts from Azerbaijani oil and gas exports. So, and obviously, Georgia is one of the other windows to import of Armenian that Armenians import using Georgian territory. The next one being Iran, the Turkish border being closed. So Armenia has maintained good, friendly relations, but in this conflict, Georgia seems to sort of be helping Azerbaijan, becoming also a transit for air flights that bring weapons and jihadi mercenaries from Syria and Libya to Azerbaijan. Georgia has denied this, but there is ample circumstantial evidence showing that Georgia is, though officially neutral, closed its eyes to these Turkish and Azeri indiscretions in transferring arms and weapons and mercenaries. It is unfortunate that being a fellow Christian country has also throughout the centuries suffered from Turkish expansionism, but economic considerations and reasons of realpolitik, unfortunately, have their say in today's political and international climate.
Thank you so much for the answer. Coming to an end, I would like to pass a word to Dr. Gevorkyan.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. Jumping in here first, in the chat room, Dr. Movsesian shared a couple of interesting readings for everyone to take away today. There's one by Hovhannes Nikahosyan, if I remember correctly, on remedial secession on Karabakh that came out in EVN report. I think that's
Alec, it's Sosi Takitian.
It's Sosi. Oh, okay, because I saw.
Yes,
There's another one. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I have to read. And the second reading is the book that Dr. Movsesian mentioned, the 30-year genocide by Morris and Zevi, right? Well, again, we have to be mindful of your time, and some of you have a hard deadline. Are there any other questions in the audience? If there are, please type them up or raise your hand so we can see you. And in the meantime, I'll just pose a general question to the panelists. We are, as academics, write academic papers, but sometimes we also write what's known as an op-ed, right? Now, one of the rules of getting op-ed into a kind of respectable paper and out there is to make it relevant, right? It has to be relevant to the readers. How do we make this issue relevant to an average person out there? This is an open question, so whoever would like to go first?
Well, I'll take a stab. I think that one of the things that you see when you study the Armenian genocide, and not just the killing part, but the whole imposition of an historical thing and that sort of thing. Armenia has every element. The history of the last 200 years of Armenia have every element that an American would be able to recognize. We're talking about post-truth. Well, yeah, that's there. If you talk about fake news, oh yeah, well, that's there. And if you talk about the importance of your identity, oh yeah, that's there. And if you take one of those, I think you can run with it. So post-truth, I would go with that. Talk about how Turkey has been buying intellectuals for years and what that has meant for the Armenians, right?
I can say, and I know Siobhan has written too in this vein. I've had some receptivity among some Christian publications, like First Things has been willing to cover this from the angle of persecuted Christians. Providence Magazine had a really good piece by Alberto Fernandez. Siobhan has written for the Imaginative Conservative. So I think another way to do this is to present this as, well, what I said before, Christians and also pro-democracy. You know, which country is on the side of democracy and which country is on the side of dictatorship. I think that's another entry point. Absolutely,
I agree. And by the way, everyone should also read Mark Movsesian's pieces for First Things. So thanks.
Yep, thank you. Dr. Tonoyan, you have any comments?
No. I'm gonna be even. I mean, why should anyone care about anything, right, at all in our society? We are sort of under pressure from all quarters. We have COVID, we have all sorts of other problems that are besetting the American mind and the American society. And in the age of social media and the age of this bombardment of information, unprecedented in history, all of this becomes a noise, just another annoying, conflict that people do over there. I recently posted on my Twitter this passage, Goethe's Faust, about people bludgeoning, killing each other down in Turkey far away. Hey, as long as I have my Zinfandel, my nice dry red wine, and I can have a nice coffee and chat with my neighbors and so on and so forth, who cares? I mean, they've been doing this for centuries. Let them do it. So it's very, very difficult because, again, we live in the age of post-truth. We have largely become desensitized to all sorts of problems. To empathy. And, do we have this deep resource of empathy still left in us to care, to have fellow feeling for fellow humans somewhere else? And it is difficult. It is a tall order to get somebody to care about anything these days, which doesn't mean we have to give up. I mean, we still have to work. We still have to write. We still have to educate. That is our job as educators. And hopefully we'll change one person at a time. And hopefully somebody that is in a place of power through some happenstance, serendipity, comes across something that I have written, something that Mark has written, or something that somebody else has written that can touch them on a psychological and emotional level and move them to act. Otherwise, I mean, rationally, really, it doesn't teach anyone's purse. This doesn't touch anyone's purse. Doesn't affect anybody's FICO score. So it's very difficult to get people to get involved in this. But I'm a believer in human goodness, ultimately, corrupted though it is by sin and selfishness. And I think if we move on, if we don't, keep on doing this, then what is the sense of it all? So I'm not a nihilist.
Isabel, do you have any other questions? Or
I have no questions. I just want to thank our panelists for making this possible. This was a very needed, informative event. And thank you so much for educating our community about the issue that is personally important to me and my family. And on this note, we'll probably have to finish this.
Yeah. And from me, thanks as well to everyone, panelists, Isabel, Basilio, organizers, and of course the audience.
Just want to announce that there will be available the recording of this webinar